to come, and he's going to bark his head off. So.
All right, we are live. Hey, everybody. We will give it a minute here as people are filing in, sitting down with their lunch. We're excited to spend the next hour with you and this great group of folks on the panel here. To kick off, I'm Mitch Stein. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Pond, who hosts these discussions every single week on Thursdays at noon. Also, we have a special perk for anyone that joins and gives us some feedback via our survey at the end. You'll get $50 in your Pond account. What is Pond? It is a marketplace for nonprofits to find and help fund anything that they need for their organization. So definitely check it out and make sure you claim those rewards. They build up really fast on average. Nonprofits using Pond save 50% on the software and services that they find through Pond. So definitely check it out. And if you have any questions, you can message me. But today is really all about the other three people here on the call that we're really excited to get to know and talk with. And we are talking everything boards. And this is a pretty no-holds-barred conversation. I mean, always know there are a lot of sometimes uncomfortable conversations or questions around building and managing boards. And so this is your chance to ask any burning question you have or get some candid feedback from our experts here. So feel free to jump into the chat and let us know who you are, where you're from, and any questions that you have that you want our group to address. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our speakers to introduce themselves. And I'll just ask, starting with Rihanna, if you can share who you are, what you do, and a few layers of your identity that are most important to you.
Thanks, Mitch. I am Rihanna Farrell. I'm the executive director of Youth Inc., and I have been in this role for 7 years. Prior to that, I spent 22 years in financial services. And when anyone asks me about my identity, I think tired working mom. It's the first thing that comes to my mind. So I am the mother of 2 teenagers and now 1 pandemic puppy who's quietly sleeping, we hope, for the next hour. And that's about it about me.
Awesome. Jeb, do you want to go next?
Oh, you're on mute.
Jeb.
Sorry, classic. Jeb Banner, CEO at Boardable. Boardable is a board management software company. We serve around 2,000 organizations around the world, predominantly nonprofits. I'm a co-founder of 3 nonprofits here in Indianapolis as well. A few layers of my identity: a father, definitely, a husband. I have 3 beautiful daughters, and I'm a musician. I play a lot of music, and right now I am in morel hunting season, so I am a forager. This is the time of year where morels pop up in Indiana, and I'm excited to go find them.
Amazing. Thank you, Jeb. And last but not least, Camilla.
Hello, everyone. I'm Camille Moyes. I use she, her pronouns. I am from the California Center. We service LGBTQ young people who are in need of homes, so folks in the homelessness sector. And some pieces about my identity: Black, gay. You can find me in the gym. I've been a gym rat past couple of months, and yeah, I'm happy to be here with you all.
Amazing. Well, I'm really excited about the diversity of background and perspective from leadership to on-the-ground grassroots work. There we go. He's a work, Brianna. To technology, and I think those are all really important parts of this discussion around boards. To get started, just to level set with everybody, we all talk about boards a lot. Rihanna, I'd love to get your perspective on kind of like a board 101. Like, why is it there? Why is it such an important thing for nonprofits? Yes, Rihanna.
Can you start with Jeb and I'll deal with the puppy?
Yes. Jeb, do you want to kick that off?
Sure. Boards are critical for nonprofits. I think about it just on a structural level. Healthy board, healthy organization, healthy community. When you have a dysfunctional board, you see it cascade throughout the organization. When you don't have the governance and oversight that organization needs, both in terms of how they're operating, their financials, how they're going out to the community, how they're serving the populations they serve. The board really is the ultimate guider of all of those decisions. They're the ones that hires and fires the executive director. They're often providing important strategic guidance around fundraising, around marketing and communications, so many different areas. And different boards can serve different roles. You have boards, and of course you have committees. Those committees can be very impactful as they're an extension, especially a small nonprofit, is an extension of the staff. So, having started a few nonprofits early on, those boards really are the team. And then as the boards grow, they become a little bit more governing boards versus working boards. And that's an important shift they make. And people struggle with that shift. We can dig into that. But at a high level, they provide a really important role in giving guidance to that organization.
Yeah, Rehana, how have you seen that scale, as Jed mentioned, between like the earliest founding days of a really young nonprofit through growth through maybe a more mature organization?
Yeah, so at You Think, one of the things that we do is build the capacity of nonprofits in New York City through exemplary governance practices. And so we see that transition that Jeb just mentioned a lot, in that a lot of organizations are started by someone like Mitch with a vision, and he wants to start a company, and that's great. And so a lot of the people on the board end up being people in his network. And so we help nonprofits make that shift from a founding board with a lot of friends and family on the board to one that is more a true governing board. And that's where you have more formal committees, and people are really recruited on a skills-based way to really advance the mission of the organization and bring those added skills that are needed to the board for it to continue to function and really carry out its mission as a fiduciary, and providing the oversight of the organization and making sure that the organization has the resources required to fulfill its mission.
Yeah, and one thing you brought up specifically, Rihanna, was about like skills based, and they're bringing something to the board. Camilla, what are some good signals for like if a board member is kind of doing what they're supposed to do, or if they are fulfilling the roles or requirements that they are supposed to, and how have you seen that pop up where people have to address board members that maybe aren't fulfilling that role?
I feel like what Jeb brought up around the strategy piece is key. And in terms of board members fulfilling their roles, it's really the engagement. Like, how engaged are you, like, not only in those board meetings, but also outside of those board meetings? What work are you doing outside to bring back in and hold folks accountable to? And it's funny, like, when you're like, I feel like difficult conversations always come up. So like when somebody is not fulfilling their roles within a board, I feel like we have experienced challenges with like addressing those members. And one like kind of tool that we use here is like looking at like, do we have term limits, and are we abiding by those term limits, and like are we holding folks accountable to those term limits, and like using that as a way into those conversations, and discussing like really like bringing up like what we need, and like what are the core values, what are our missions, and how those board members can fulfill those roles.
Yeah, and something you brought up around like the difficult conversation, I think oftentimes it's difficult when it's personal. Like if you as a person are like pointing out something wrong with that person, whereas if you've set an expectation going into it, you're like, you can both look at it and you can agree like, hey, this is what we said we were going to do. This is not being achieved. You're kind of separating the person from the problem, which helps take some of the scariness out of those conversations, I would imagine. Rihanna, especially for executive directors, I find, Jeb mentioned that power dynamic of like they hire and fire the ED. And yet I've talked to plenty of executive directors, especially new ones that have kind of inherited a board, that are really frustrated with engaging with them. How do you advise EDs to be making sure that the board's giving them leverage, to make sure their strategy is giving them board leverage as opposed to draining them and their team?
I think it goes back to something Camilla said just now, which I think is super important. I wanted to echo is just like building your values with your board. And so to your point, Mitch, about it not being personal, if we all say, this is the code of conduct that we've adopted, these are the board roles and responsibilities that you signed. If you leverage exemplary governance practices, it really is then not about whether or not I like Mitch. It's just about, is Mitch upholding the things that we all agreed are the duties of the board, and the way in which we're asking directors to go about that duty. So I thought that was super important, Camilla. So I would just echo that. And then, sorry, Mitch, I totally lost your question.
For new executive directors in particular, where you have like an inherited board,
yes.
Like what are the best first steps to get off on the right foot with
and
those
so
folks?
I would say it all stems back to that, right? So if that isn't in place at the organization that you've just taken over, then that's, I would say, your first step is adopting those exemplary governance practices. And we actually use a wonderful consultant, Jennifer Rutledge, who I like to say has forgotten more than I will ever learn about exemplary governance practices. And we help meet an organization where they are. So, Camilla just took over the Ali Forney Center. She inherited a really engaged board with really mature exemplary governance practices. So that might be a lighter touch, right? Mitch just took over something that looked like it was, going to fail, and he stepped in as a board member to make sure it didn't fail. Well, there might be a little bit more work to do. And so we don't just have one prescribed way to adopt exemplary governance, because every organization is different, whether it's founder led and you're in that pivotal transition from a founder to the first non-founder ED, where we see a lot of organizations really struggle. I think the stat is 33% of all founder transitions fail. So it's a huge number. And so you really have to take the exemplary practice and where the organization is. And I would say do this in a more bespoke way. There is no, I'll say, just read this article, read this book, do these 5 things and you'll be good. It really is very hyper specific for every organization, where they are on their journey, their culture, their values. There isn't just one silver bullet.
And if I may add something.
Go ahead, Camille.
I would also add to that, do not overlook community building and rapport building, to kind of build those relationships with your board, not only between the ED and the board members, but also between the board members amongst themselves as well, as a really huge piece as well.
Yeah, I was gonna mention that very same thing, Camilla. I think that's so critical for a new executive director to come in and just be human with the board members. Just say, hey, tell me about your life. Let's go out and get lunch. Let's have a dinner with some folks, because that relationship gives them the trust then to have the conflict they need to make the changes in the organization that inevitably are going to need to happen when you have a new executive director come in. You have to have a foundation of trust to have conflict. And that relationship is so critical. On the value side, I just want to echo that. Sometimes I think about it as moving from me to we language. And when you say, I need this, or I'm disappointed in this, versus we behave this way, these are the values that we honor in this organization. It moves into a tribal framework, which is more what human beings are wired from, and they move out of a state of threat, and they seek to become they want to be part of the tribe, versus feeling attacked, and they get into a defensive posture. So I just wanted to say that something I find very helpful, businesses and nonprofits, is that we language.
Yeah, it was part of a conversation.
Staff too, I would say, right? And so I think one of the things about having a healthy, thriving board is really just that alignment with your staff. And so if you have one set of values and practices with your staff and a different one with your board, that's going to create, some natural inherent friction.
Yeah, and I think another shared thing with the board and the staff is at the ED or leadership level is not only how do you motivate someone to do something. So I've heard this all the time, how do I get my board member to do more? Or how do I get them to make more asks, or get them to have more follow through? And I think framing that as more of a, how do I inspire? How do I make sure I'm inspiring people to move towards those goals? Have you found that effective with executive directors, Rihanna, when they're struggling at that core engagement with someone and making that decision of is it me? Is it them? I'm not getting response. They're not engaging. How do you counsel people in that situation?
I would say to ask questions, right? Typically something is up and they didn't sign up for something that they wanted to be bad at, right? And they're volunteers, right? So to really, I would say, probe a little bit around what's driving that disconnect. And maybe it is, I'll say, not having the same expectations. And so I think the same thing goes for boards in terms of new EDs, and just unrealistic expectations about what a new ED can come in and hold, and what they can accomplish in what amount of time. And so much of this, I think, to Jeb's point about establishing relationships so that you can have constructive conflict, is just a critical baseline for anything that you want to do moving forward, to have a more difficult conversation about expectations.
Yeah. Jeb, one thing that you and I were talking about actually just a few days ago is how people underestimate the ways that technology can really improve engagement and take the burden off of a stretched leader to get more out of their board, as obviously what you do day in and day out. But I'd love for you to share a little bit about how you've seen that in practice.
Yeah, an awful lot of managing a board is just logistical. And having started nonprofits before we built Boardable or had a tool like that, everything flowed through my inbox. And the nightmare of managing a board through an inbox and trying to keep everybody aligned, and random doodle polls and documents flying all over the place and attachments. At one point, I couldn't find the bylaws for one of the nonprofits I started because the lawyer that was on the board rolled off, and I just, I don't know how many hours I spent querying my inbox, right, looking for documents. That creates a lot of friction, and then also you lose a lot of the cohesion of having a one place for all conversations and content as well. When you have that one-stop shop where the board member knows that it's a special place for the board to go, and that everything they need is there, all their meetings, all their documents, all their discussions, any votes they're doing, etc. It streamlines and removes friction from their side. These are very busy people, and that's a lot of what they're struggling with is, hey, I don't want to spend 20 to 30 minutes figuring out how to serve this organization. I want to spend it serving this organization and removing that friction. And so technology can be helpful. The challenges with technology, having worked on that side of adoption, is that you're trying to break into somebody's rut. You're trying to break into whatever path they have set, and we all have our digital ruts, on our phones, on our computers. And so you're trying to disrupt and change some behavior there. And so there's a decent amount of persistence needed on the administrative side of things to say, hey, this is how we're working, and to wean them off the old way, which is the inefficient but comfortable and known way of doing it, to the new, more efficient and scalable way of doing things as you transition into new technology.
Yeah, we're really fortunate at UThink to have a board platform provided to us by NASDAQ on a pro bono basis that we use for all of our board materials. And as you were talking, Jeb, I was like, yes, and yes. And it's just hard, right? Because you're changing behavior. So anytime you want to change behavior, it's just going to take a while, but it really is worth it to stick to it. And then you have one set of books and records, and it's not staff dependent, it's not director dependent. You aren't wondering where things are. They're always in the same place. So it is definitely worth the pain of making that switch out of one rut into a new, more sustainable and more leverageable one for the organization.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a big equity component, I think, in better utilizing tech, because a new board member coming in, especially, there's a lot of emphasis on better representation on boards. Okay, and how do you set someone up for success when they're entering a new board? If they come in and it's like, okay, yeah, we'll start sending you emails, they have no access to the history of what's been happening at that board, and they're trying to play catch up, and they're behind. And they, if you give people easy access to where all the materials live, here's how ease of engagement, I just have to imagine that is really important. Camilla, I'd love to hear, I know this is a huge focus area of yours as the Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Ali Forney Center, so I'd love to hear more about your perspective on that.
As far as technology and the equity component?
Yeah, and setting new board members up for success as well.
So here at the Ali Forney Center, and this was mentioned earlier around the committee structure, I know we have a nominations committee, and they have been put together to really focus on how to best orient folks to our board, to the culture of the board, to operations, to the mission of the organization, so on and so forth. And a lot of pieces that we have already brought up is also, for example, the values piece that Rahana brought up, the culture building and community building and rapport building that Jeb kind of echoed. And it's how do we also, when Rahana said about asking questions, how do we ensure that folks' roles on the board are clear, right? So when we are bringing somebody on and we do see that lack of engagement that you kind of described, do they know what is expected of them, what we need from them, so on and so forth? Have we made that clear as an organization? All of those pieces I feel are really important when setting up a new board member for success. Making sure their role is clear, making sure that we don't have like cliques, right? That everyone feels welcome, included, that their voice or their opinions are valued, that they are part of the decision making, if that is the case, or if they're not part of the decision making, what is their role or final say on any type of decision that is coming up. I would add to that question.
Yeah, if I
Yeah,
can piggyback
please
on
go
that a
ahead.
little bit, I've compared joining a board to coming into a movie in the middle of it. And you're like, why is this guy angry? Why is she walking out the door? You know, like, what's going on here? Because you don't have a lot of context.
Or
So
just like
having,
what they're talking about, right? Like the
yeah,
acronym soup of an organization, and you're
all
like
yeah,
trying to catch up. You feel like you missed the first critical thesis of the movie.
yeah, you don't have the
I love the
context.
analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you're like, gosh, I need to rewind this movie. So having something in place where they can rewind and go back and read the minutes and look back at the documents and be like, oh, okay, so this person's been on board this long. This person's been on the board this long. I have context now. This person's been here 10 years. That's why, you know, they kind of carry a little more weight in the conversation. Maybe they've been here too long, you know, whatever it might be. That's a whole
Right.
nother conversation because that happens. But yeah, it's really important to accelerate that onboarding, because if it takes them a year to get up to speed, they may only serve 2 to 3 years on that board, and you're losing a year of really qualitative, you know, service.
I completely agree. You think we've just revamped our onboarding and engaged our directors more in the process so that it's not staff driven, but really board led. And I'm already seeing the returns on that in terms of new directors just finding their groove more quickly. And we also launched a few years ago a board mentor program so that people feel specific responsibility to check in with Mitch before the first meeting, to check in with Mitch after his first meeting. What questions do you have? Like trying to bring that tome of information that we now have also in a central location to life a little bit, and just making sure, I think to Camilla's point, that people feel like the process is held and that someone cares about whether or not you're finding your way if you have questions. I think it goes a lot to culture in terms of equity and inclusion.
And also thinking about, before you bring the board member on, how you're having them engage with the organization, like in that like recruitment process. So one piece that we have a potential board member, I believe, volunteer for a year before they are onto our board. So how are they interfacing and engaging with our larger community?
That's an interesting
love
approach. I've not heard that before. I like that. Give me a year of volunteer service, just so they understand the organization and they've shown they care too.
Exactly. Commitment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think especially you find so many board members are bringing skills that maybe you don't have within the organization today. And so that also can equate to being fairly far from the issue and the actual like impact being had by the organization. So any ways that you can help bring them into the mission and service, I love that. I hadn't heard that either. Yeah, thank you for sharing. One other example I was going to give just on the technology front that happened recently was, documents needing to be signed, getting sent over email and asking people to like print them off and sign them. And I was politely like, hey, there's a lot of tools that are really pretty cheap that you could send this to everyone on the board and save, because I'm sorry, I'm not the most responsive over email. I'm really busy. If I'd been able to 3 clicks through a DocuSign, like you would have had this from me in 2 seconds, but now you've had to follow up with me 6 times. It's been hanging over my head for a month. And it's like, to your point, Jeb, both the time and the mind share of your board, like that's not what you want me to be doing. Like, there are way higher value things I could be doing. And so I just think empowering people to be thinking about new tools and technology, it doesn't even need to be like a full-blown board management tool. Like that's a really simple, specific example where like you could have put that in the Google Drive, or you could have like put that on, like there are just little tech changes that should be front of mind for people too, for optimization.
That also makes me think of even the virtual world. I feel like we say it enough, like through this whole like pandemic, like how like being able to meet virtually like has helped a lot. But even thinking about boards and accessibility in terms of like when diversifying your board, like thinking about how folks are like do they have money like to travel, like because like a big piece on us was like bringing on clients or former clients onto our board. So again, we service like homeless youth. So like, would there be like travel implications, like for both Jeb and Rahana? I feel like you all have families, right? So like thinking about like caretaking like issues, and do folks have money to like pay for what's the word that I'm looking for? Childcare. So like how to create those accessibility features when thinking about like, because it's a requirement for board members to come to those meetings. So technology, like in this virtual world, has helped a lot of folks be able to meet that requirement.
Yeah,
and help with equity.
We've seen that. We survey our customers, and we've seen that boards have become much more geographically diverse over the last 2 years. And we built something in our product called Spotlight, which actually has video functionality in it, knowing that we were going to have these boards that were going to be hybrid. You're going to have some folks at home because maybe they don't have that childcare, and some folks in the room, and we want them to have an equitable experience. So there's an equitable kind of dynamic to the board experience in terms of being able to give access to that person that's joining from their cell phone, and that person that can afford to drive across town at 4 o'clock, right, and attend in person. It allows you to bring in a more diverse population of board members. And one of the big challenges I see with a lot of boards, and we can talk about this, I'm sure it's a bit of a shift, is their board does not represent and look like the populations they serve. It looks more like their funding population, which understandable on some level. The funders matter, they're not unimportant. But I think there's been a shift in the ability to accommodate a wider range of board members because of the adoption of technology. And I think that's been a good change.
I agree. And I would say, while it is a really important responsibility of the board to ensure that the organization has the resources required to fulfill and advance its mission, it's also really important to think about representation. And we at Youth Inc. Recognize that because of the way we had structured our give-get historically, we had precluded people outside of financial services who earn what you earn in financial services and have networks that are very lucrative for fundraising. And so we've actually just shifted, I think, a major policy that I think is worth talking about here, from an individual give-get to a collective give-get, so that we don't create seats on the board that are, I'll say, like the academic seat or the nonprofit seat, where you might feel like it is that you have less of a voice because it's not a money seat and a fundraising seat. So it really is, everyone on the board is an equal, and we as a board are going to commit to giving $1 million and raising $3 million. And that's our collective. And my role in that might be more than the average, and your role might be less than the average, but both of us are equally valued for the other things that we're bringing, whether that's our lived experience or our subject matter expertise. And so I think that's one way that you can go about this from an equity standpoint. But I really love what the two of you just said about tech. And I think there's more that we need to do there as we continue to diversify our board.
Camille, I know you were nodding pretty aggressively there. I know what have you seen around the evolution of the give-get component of the board?
Here on the California Center side, we also took away like that minimum like financial contribution piece. So that's why I was like nodding a lot, and that has helped some other folks like help our board become more representative of like our staff and our clients. And like we're totally not like even there yet, but we're getting there. So that's why I was nodding aggressively, because we've also kind of made that switch. But I need to ask if it has switched to like a collective piece. I really like that piece. So thank you, Rahana, for sharing that.
And I think a lot of
leap of faith, I will tell you, that the development director and I were like, a few Hail Marys, a few Our Fathers, and we're just going to, see how this goes, because it's really such a shift. And so I think it's important to acknowledge when you're uncomfortable with a shift, to say like, this wasn't easy. It's not like we didn't talk about it. We did a ton of analysis, and luckily it's worked out really well. And we're asking people to give it their personal best level and make room for people on the board who don't come from the same background.
That's amazing.
I'd love to go through a couple scenarios, because I think we've mentioned a lot of great best practices and things that make sense. You get it. But then once you're in the situation and you're like, yeah, I wish I would have set up better expectations, but now I'm in this position where I have a board member who's not responding to me, or not showing that they mirror our values. What do I do now? I don't know if we could do a little either role play or just like if you were coaching that person who like truly has a board member that they think they need to tell, like, you need to move on. Like, how do you go about having that conversation? And I don't know, Jeb, if you've been in that position before, or I'm sure everyone has.
I've been in the position of transitioning 3 executive directors and a number of board members too. It requires a very heart-centered approach, and coming from a place of respect and love for that person, and honoring them as a human being, and saying, here's what I'm expecting and here's what I'm experiencing, and I want to understand your experience and help me understand how there's a disconnect here, because that's what I'm seeing. And if they're not engaging, or they're clearly just pulling away, then you can call it and say, hey, we're going to let you go at this point. It's not making sense. Maybe down the road we can re-engage in another way. But there's also another way to do it, which is more the accountability method of saying, you're just not showing up. And this is what we expect. This is what you signed up for. That's a little bit more on the sort of absent board member side. On the disruptive or dysfunctional board member side, one that maybe is dominating the discussions, or is not stepping down because there isn't term limits in place and the board can't seem to get them in place, whatever it might be. I think that's where you have to take a very much a human approach, and seek to understand what their experience is, and share with them what your expectations are and where there's a disconnect, and see if they can change. Give them an opportunity. In most cases, it's time for them to move on. But I think board chairs and executive directors have to be very skilled in difficult, hard conversations. That's just a big part of the job. The difference between a good and a great organization is a lot of hard conversations. That's businesses and nonprofits. So I recommend crucial conversation training. There's a training practice you can go through. There's a lot of other ones you can do for chairs and for EDs.
I don't know if you have that training link handy, but that would be worthwhile dropping in the chat. That sounds really powerful. And I would just add to that, just the idea of directors holding each other accountable. So your point about the board chair, I don't think this should just be the executive director who has to have the hard conversations. And that does switch when you're going from a founding to a governing board. Your board chair really should be the person who's right there either with you or having this conversation on behalf of the organization. But I love the idea of, providing skills with that message, Jeb. So, giving people the tools and resources they need to really grow into those responsibilities, I think is fantastic.
I shared it in the private chat. I'm not sure how to share in the other chat. So maybe someone can move it over.
I was just going to add too, and I know this came up in the chat earlier. Kyla had asked, so yes, we record this session. It'll be available on YouTube and LinkedIn immediately afterwards. And we also put a really great summary together in the coming days where we'll link to different resources mentioned in the chat. So we will have that for sure. We also turn the audio into a podcast, Kyla. So that'll be out in a few weeks, and you can even get all this great insight on a run. Sorry, Camilla, I cut you off. You're about to say something.
No, it's fine. I just wanted to offer like what I understand from like our side. So for years or for quite some time, our board was discussing like, oh, we really need to diversify. We really need to diversify. But it was only like a discussion. It was only like a talking point. There was no action to do so. And under our previous executive director, there wasn't any like firm push or anything like that. So when Alex Roque, our current director, came on board, he made that known, like, hey, we've been talking about diversifying the board for a while. We've spoke about like, or we brought in consultants to continue the conversation. We've done trainings and education to continue the conversation, but it has just stayed as a conversation amongst us. They've also even, they strategized around, okay, like let's open up 10 more seats, and these 10 seats will go to like folks to be more representative of our population. But what ended up happening is that they still kept hiring or bringing on the same type of board members. And in our case, my understanding, it was like cis white male attorneys, like those that was our board makeup. So what Alex did was, as coming on as ED, he made it a priority, like, to bring action into this. So what he did, he's asked 10 board members to step down. He said like it wasn't received very well. But going back to that commitment that the board have been collectively talking about, we need to diversify. Going back to what I mentioned earlier, using those term limits. So for folks whose term limits were up that we didn't like in their term, like those terms were ended. And for folks who were reaching their ending, like conversations were had with them to transition them out. And what he did was created an advisory board. So like folks weren't like totally pushed out of the agency, out of the board. They just became an advisory board. Like they still have connections to the organization, but they don't have like the governance of like within being the board. And that's one way of how we kind of handled it. I can't give much insight to how those tough conversations happen, but like a little bit of strategy around how we were able to push through.
Yeah, Rehana, what would if someone is in a similar situation that maybe the Ali Forney Center was a few years ago, where they're like, okay, yeah, we get it now. We really need to diversify our board, but you haven't really made much progress historically. Like, what are the right first steps for someone to take?
For us, we embedded diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging into our board through exemplary governance. And so we had a DEIB task force in July of 2020 that met for about a year, and it was a catalyst. So a task force isn't a standing committee because they're meant to serve a purpose and then transition that purpose. And so we went through all of our committee charters and we talked about like how does diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging show up in comp committee, in audit committee, in development committee, and literally updated charters and added different deliverables for that committee to consider and execute on throughout the course of their work. And so it makes it more durable when it's not, like the ED saying, I'm holding you all accountable, right? It helps when everyone feels like this is our shared goal and this is my job as an audit committee member to make sure that our auditor is, somebody who is that we've considered a diverse slate of potential auditors and that they themselves at their firm clearly value and demonstrate their commitment to DEIB. And so whatever it is, it's like, how does it infuse at every level of the work of the organization, as opposed to a DEIB committee, which then sits over here and is in a silo. So we are definitely trying to infuse this as a value across all committees, across all staff work, across all of our work as an intermediary with the nonprofit partners that we have. And so I do think what your ED did was like sort of noble and valiant and hard and good, but it's also just like a really hard way to do it, as opposed to saying like, this is our collective understanding and our collective belief and what we're going to move forward to do on a collective basis. So the more that you can do it, I'll say using the structure of the organization and figuring out what are the intentional and structural changes that we're going to need to make to live this value. I think it then also isn't, person dependent. So if your ED were to leave, would you then revert back, or have you really built the muscle and has it really taken root in the organization?
Yeah, I'd add another just specific example too, where I'm on the board at the LGBT Center here in New York. And I think a lot of organizations, after something happens, like the murder of George Floyd, were like, okay, we need to make a statement about racial equity and we're going to do like 20 things and we're going to do them next week. And there's just like big push to want to do something, which I think we all can appreciate. But what I really appreciate about what the center, they had already done a 2-year consulting study of the organization's DEI practices. So if you're having an issue with the board, it's probably reflected in the organization and the staff and how you're serving community. And let's get down into the weeds of like where this is showing up across your programs and services, and not thinking that you're going to like just solve something at the board. Because like Rehana said, it is infused throughout every part of and very pervasive. So it was started with the staff and then moved to a board working group that we met monthly. And after a year of that, took the entire board through a 3-month intensive every other week sessions around racial equity and how it shows up within our organization and community. And after that, thought about how do we reframe our mission and values as an organization. So that was like a 3-year process, which like there's urgency to address these issues. They also think, to your point, like you want to be really thoughtful and intentional of like infusing it at every level of the organization.
And that in and of itself is hard. So I will share that at You Think we all wanted to be responsive to that moment. And there was a moment of like, well, silence is consent. I don't consent, so I can't be silent, but I also can't rush to get something out, right? And have it really represent the whole organization. So our DEIB statement of commitment probably took close to a year to publish. But it took the time necessary to align the board and the staff so that it was really an organizational statement. And each part of our organization really made it better and more holistic and more encompassing. So I think the time is worth it, but we all live in a world that's like, I need to respond, right? And so it's like, how do you manage that tension of being responsive and not being silent with being inclusive and taking, your time? And just, it wasn't easy. For us, our nonprofit partners, I would say similar to your journey at the center, Mitch, told us about some explicit practices that we had in place that were really damaging, which was never our intention as an intermediary. And so when our board took in that feedback, it was a like lightning bolt, sort of watershed event of like, well, that's not what I wanted. Like I'm doing exactly what I don't want to be doing. So how do we do something different? So it was definitely a catalytic moment in our nation's history for us to all be more reflective and figure out what it is that we want to do differently moving forward.
And to echo and add, like definitely echoing that DEI shouldn't be separate or in addition to, but part of, which is the infusion that Rahana and Mitch is talking about. And I feel like the process that Mitch is describing is where we actually are now. So in like me coming into my role as the director of equity and inclusion, how do I infuse that into the values and like help it like streamline down into the organization? Because it is very much what's happening at the board level is very much reflective of what's happening in the organization. And what I'm working on now is how to bring that like how to create those values, which Rahana and Jeb spoke about way in the beginning, because that's something we lack. We don't have shared values. So how do I do that along with the board to trickle down to the staff? And like the goal is how do we best infuse equity into each part, those committees, the orientation, like the way the board works, so on and so forth. And yeah, that's where we are now.
Jeb, I'm sure you've seen this before, but do you have any examples or like red flags of where people have made mistakes in trying to either overcorrect or react quickly around something like board diversity or just other changes they want to see at the board and they aren't thoughtful enough about it? Like, where do people go wrong in that well-intentioned change they're trying to execute?
Yeah, I've seen knee-jerk reactions, which are, to what Rihanna was saying, not thoughtful. They not going through the real consideration. You want to speak up. You want to get out there and do something. But you also want to be thoughtful about that because you are speaking on behalf of the organization. So I serve on the United Way board here in Indiana, and there was a lot of internal debate around how to react to some of the events in 2020, George Floyd being one of the primary ones. And I think they did it well. The challenge you often balance with is that there's a lot of internal pressure from the staff to potentially put out a message which would have been even more aggressive on some of the hot issues of the moment, like funding the police and things like that. That could be challenging at times for an organization of that stature in the community. You have to balance those things, and it feels a little political, to be honest. And the reality is that we do exist in a political environment, and we have to be sensitive to how we are perceived while still standing behind our values. It's a really interesting dance, and I think that nobody does it perfectly, not that I've seen. And I think seeking forgiveness and grace when you don't land it is important. I think the core of this for me is to honor the unique, specialness, the divinity, if you will, in all human beings, and to honor the experience they're having as well from all their different backgrounds, and speaking up on their behalf so that they can have a seat at the table. And that's the real work. I feel too often we do the lip service of that, but not the work of it. And the real work of it is being present in their lives and honoring who they are and giving them real legitimate opportunities to be part of something, not just talking about them. And that's different. So a statement is not change. And that's something that I think we all need to do better at.
Completely agree. And I was thinking in my head, as you said, grace, the very same word. It's something that our DEIB consultant talks about all the time. I used to use the phraseology of just presuming good intent and making sure that, like if you're a volunteer on my board, or if you work at, you think that we're all sort of in this for the same reasons, right reasons, and so to try to center that and just keep open-minded. There was a article that came out in the Atlantic, I think it was today, it might have been sometime earlier this week, about just how fraught everyone is. Like there are more accidents, there are more, like Chris Rock, Will Smith incidents, so it's just everybody is really stressed out. And so, it's really hard as an executive director, coaching other executive directors, working with a very large board, just to keep centered and, keep that idea of grace and presuming good intent front and center in all of these conversations.
And I would add the grace piece, not only from others, but also for yourself, like asking for grace for yourself as well, because it's hard work and the work is not going to stop. The work will continue to evolve. One thing I say to both like the board and like to my largest staff, like in my humanness, is like, hey, like this is new work for our organization to some degree. Yes, there are templates and best practices that exist, but a lot of it, because we are a unique group of people, I'm figuring out and I'm learning as we go about it. And like I welcome folks on that learning journey with me. I invite folks to like hold me accountable to things that I'm putting out there, or to like each other. And I feel like that has also helped this process a lot. But like also give grace to yourself.
Such a good
I think
point.
that Rihanna, reminding people too, when you can feel, I think as a leader, a good trait of a good leader is like recognizing when tensions are like ratcheting up, or things like understanding the environment you're in and taking those moments to point out like, hey, we are all here for the same reason, right? Like, let's get back to what you think does, or what the Ellie Forney Center does, why we're all here, why we care. And I think that helps people see the humanity in each other, because it's like, oh yeah, we do have this in common. Like we're here for the same reason.
Totally. Jim, do you have another conflict resolution, training that you would drop in the chat for all of us that Mitch can push out on social media later this week? Because I do think that's like a bigger part of this than most people are, we're really thinking about going into whatever roles they're in right now, just given the last 2 years.
Yeah, I think that we are at an all-time high in my lifetime of stress and anxiety, and we are often projecting that upon others, and that's creating conflict that we don't know how to handle and process. Someone mentioned in the chat 4 Agreements. I think they're fantastic. That's a great book, great framework. I think the Patria Lencioni writing is really strong as well. The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team.
Yes.
It's all about trust building to conflict, and then to conflict to agreement, and then commitment, and then to results. Those are really good resources, and there's workbooks that go with them as well. I think bringing in an outside facilitator is helpful when you're working through these things, because you need everyone to be a participant. You need somebody to be the one that's the moderator, because it's important that everyone contributes and is involved. But yeah, there's a lot of content out there, and my wife is a coach and facilitator, so I bet she could give us an encyclopedia of resources if I pinged her on it.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I did a session at the N10 conference about a month ago, actually with my college negotiations professor from Wharton, and she gave an amazing rundown about handling internal conflict within an organization. So we have a summary of that and a recap that we'll definitely drop in the recap blog post too. She's amazing, Professor Beer. One thing that I'd love to shift to, because it's hard to believe we only have about 10 minutes left, but we've been talking about like the work of a leader primarily within the nonprofit of how to best manage boards. Could we shift a little bit to anyone on the call or that wants to deliver a message to a board member, or someone that wants to be a better board member? Rehana, starting with you, like what are you thinking back all your years of working with boards and being on boards, like the standout board members, what do they have in common? What do they do? And what would you advise people seeking to do better in their board service?
Such a great question. At Youth Inc., we are blessed to have a really large, active, engaged board. And I would say what they have in common is like a deep passion for the mission and to also really, I'll say, stay in a governance zone. So I hear a lot from nonprofits about boards sort of overreaching and dealing with staff on management issues. And we just don't have that issue at Youth Inc. And so I know that I'm very fortunate in that regard. So to really, I would say, educate yourself on, what are the roles of a board member. I think this goes back, Jeb, to what you're saying about onboarding and making sure you have all that information. It's really hard to hold someone accountable to a standard that you're not educating them on, right? So like to have your onboarding really talk about the primary duties of a board member and talk about then how that applies to your organization, because it is a little bit different for every organization. So how do those duties and those responsibilities show up at your organization so that you, to Jeb's point, you establish the relationship and the positive relationship that can serve as a basis for conflict should it arise, but that you've also educated them and you're going into it with the same values and a common understanding of what the roles and responsibilities of a board member are. And then I think people most often would self-select to say, I can't do this anymore. We agreed that these are our values. We agreed that these are the roles and responsibilities of a board member. And more often than not, people will come to me and say, I can't fulfill these anymore, as opposed to me having to say, Mitch, about these responsibilities, these are the 5 that you're not getting done. So I do think there's so much of this that goes into, staff really working to make sure directors are onboarded so that directors can hold themselves accountable to the governance level and stay in their governance lane and not in the staff management lane.
Jeb, I'd have the same question for you. What advice would you give, maybe a slightly different, to a new board member? So if you're maybe first-time board service or first-time joining a nonprofit board, how would you say, what would be your advice to be the best contributor you can be to that organization?
I think it's really important to understand expectations. Make sure that if they're not being explicitly communicated, to all but demand that they are, like, what is your expectation of me? And I think also share your expectations, what you'd like to get out of that board service, how you think you can provide value, what's the special talent or genius that you have that the board can leverage to make sure that you're being used in the right way. I think it's important early on to listen more than you talk, to build relationships, rapport, understand, get context, and then begin contributing as you understand how you can bring your unique gifts to that board. And do your homework. Get up to speed on the organization, on the board. As Camilla mentioned, volunteer, roll up your sleeves, get involved so that you really feel the impact the organization has. You can think you understand the impact, but until you feel it, feeling is different than thinking. And I think board members that feel what the organization's doing have a different perspective when decisions are made than ones that just have a conceptual understanding.
And Camilla, I'd ask you the question slightly differently. We've talked a lot about board diversification. What if you're that person that's coming in to help diversify the board? Like, that's kind of an uncomfortable position to be in. You're sort of like the tip of the spear, helping tip the scales back to more representation. What would your advice be to that person that has maybe even been offered a position on a board where they know it historically hasn't been very diverse, or when they're getting started in that position, what's the best thing that they can do?
I would say, going back to something Rahana spoke about earlier, is like definitely ask questions, but also within that, like, understand like your boundaries and like your comfort zones, and being able to communicate that to your fellow members, but also like be authentic in terms of like keeping in mind what Jeb said about observing before like jumping in, but like don't hold back your experience and like share. And I think that that's what I would add, but also speak up about what is uncomfortable for you or what is not allowable, like in a respectful, like appropriate way.
Yeah, and I think part of what Camilla just brought up, Brianna, is alluding to some power dynamics that exist within a board, either within a board or between a board and executive director. Like, how can you help maybe eliminate or diffuse some of those more toxic power dynamics as a board member? Because the reality is that you're the boss of this executive director. So it's sort of hard to develop true rapport when you're the boss. Like, how do you bridge that gap to build better relationships with leadership in the organization?
That is such a great question. I feel like I came into Youth Inc. as executive director, having been solicited as a board member. And so I've always felt like a peer with my board. And I know that for a lot of executive directors, that's not the case, particularly those who have come up through program, who represent the community served. And there is that racial disparity. So board diversity has only improved by 2% in the last 20 years. So that's almost not at all. That's like a standstill. And so we hear a lot from BIPOC EDs in particular, just what those power dynamics are like around racial equity and competency and comfort in talking about it, willingness to do it, having the commitment to change. And so that is not an easy, I'll say, soundbite takeaway, but really, something, I think, Camilla, to your point of like, take care of yourself and give yourself grace, like really recognize the hill that you are trying to climb, ask for help, look for outside resources. Jeb, you named a couple favorites of mine. Somebody else in the chat had also put out radical candor. So like, be open about the struggle that you're having and look for resources that will sustain you and help you overcome them, whether it's with pedagogy or just, like the support you need to keep to it, because that's a really big power dynamic to address. And so it's not an easy one click. Pond can't solve that one. Pond can solve a lot of challenges. That is a really big one, and it's really nested, right? So it's really hard to start to like dig in and unravel that.
Yeah, I think something that you've shown me too within the Youth Inc. organization is the power of the peer support, right? Which find your other EDs in similar situations. You got to find your people where you can let your hair down and just really have honest conversations. So I think that's a big one too, is making sure you've got some like peer level support where it's an outside perspective.
Absolutely. And just sharing best practices and things that have worked, to spark your own thinking about, would this work at my organization? So for sure.
Yeah. And lastly, I would just ask, and it's been referenced a couple times, when you need outside help, like how do you know if you need a board consultant, or like how do you go about hiring a DEI consultant? I don't know, Camilla, if you have a view on how to know when your organization needs some expertise.
For me, my thumb on it is that I realize, like, at our level, like, of course there's going to be differing opinions around how to like go about things, and I feel like that's when we have named it, when we can't get outside of that and come to a consensus, that's when we have named like getting help. Like currently, like we are looking at a couple of consultants to help with our D and I B work. So it's like not being able to come to a common ground. And we have the resources, so why not, right? So like definitely like use that to invest in it.
I would concur exactly. When you're sort of stuck and you're not able to break through and move forward, that's when it's a good sign that you need some outside expertise, or just going into it recognizing none of us are expert in this, so we should reach out and find someone who is.
And Jeb, how have you seen organizations successfully allocate budget to that? Because sometimes that's like the biggest, hardest pill to swallow, is like, yeah, we'd love a consultant, but I'm not sure we could pay for it.
Yeah, United Way's made a big shift and brought on leadership focused on DEIB, and so made a real financial commitment to that. Brought in, I just did board training last week with the interactive acting troupe. It was really a great experience. I think you just have to sort of look at where you're at as an organization in terms of your maturity. A young organization may not have the resources to spend money on this. They may need to do something that's a little bit more YouTube based, or look at the free resources out there, go to their local United Ways and other organizations that might have resources for them. and piggyback off of them and do a little bit more themselves. The more mature the organization, the more they should and can allocate budget. So I think it's a sliding scale depending upon where they are financially. A lot of groups are just struggling to get by, and they've got to focus on the people they're serving, and that's job one. And I think that's the most important thing they can do, because often those people are of a very diverse background and are struggling, to have an equitable experience in modern society. So I think it's a sliding scale depending upon where the organization's at.
Awesome. Yeah, and there's, like you mentioned, a variety of resources. So, well, thank you. We are at time. I don't want to hold anybody up. I know everyone's busy. Thank you to everyone who was so active in the chat, asked a bunch of great questions. Appreciate our panelists. Don't forget that you can get $50 in your Pond account just for attending this session and taking some time to invest in yourself. So that survey link is on the site. You'll get an email about it if you registered. And thank you, everybody. We'll hopefully see you here next week, Thursdays at noon. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Guy, thank you.